So you've watched a video where I explain how to write learning outcomes. And this video is going to walk you through another important step in the process of coming up with learning outcomes, and that's aligning those outcomes with programmatic outcomes. Aligning outcomes with the course that you're teaching in, like aligning an assignment's outcomes with the course that you're teaching in, is important because it means that the entire class has a bit of cohesion. If you're aligning to program outcomes, that means that the program has some cohesion, and your colleagues who might be teaching the next writing course, they're going to know more or less what your students have learned, or at least what topics they were introduced to, and they can build their class on that knowledge. Now that doesn't mean that you should just adopt learning outcomes wholesale, like the outcomes for the program or then the outcomes that are for your class that are also the outcomes for your assignments. I'm a proponent of educators having some kind of ownership of those outcomes. Outcomes should feel authentic to you as you're teaching, and they should be written in a way that your students get them. So they kind of match the language that you're using to talk about learning in your class. The program or course learning outcomes, they should provide some inspiration, and they should maybe provide the parameters for your assignment's learning outcomes. When we align learning outcomes, we're often breaking down bigger outcomes. So outcomes for a program are then broken down into course learning outcomes. Course learning outcomes are then broken down into an assignment's learning outcomes. And if we even think about classroom activities, you could break down an assignment's outcomes into, by the end of this class, here's what I want students to learn. Here's the learning outcome for this class activity that I'm putting together. Now, if that all sounds dull and boring, I hear you. I don't think absolutely everything you do in a classroom needs to be mapped back to outcomes. I think that you can get creative in the different ways that you're connecting assignments and do kind of off the wall and weird things that do have some kind of relationship to the learning outcomes for a class, but I don't think everything needs to have a neat and tidy connection where everything is lockstep. That's just me. I think having some weirdness in a class is healthy for you, and I think it's healthy for students. It fosters creativity, and it also can make learning memorable and, dare I say, fun. You can have learning outcomes for an assignment that are creative and take on a different flavor than program outcomes or course learning outcomes. Let me give you an example. This document is the writing program outcomes for Shawnee State University's writing program. It'll be made available for you for today's discussion board activity, where you align your draft learning outcomes for your assignment. You can possibly do that here with the Shawnee State writing program outcomes. You could also take a look at other writing programs and align your assignments outcomes to those. But this is what we have for, so we have the outcomes for 1101, 1102, 1201, and then we have 1105. And it's this one down here that I want to talk a little bit more about. This outcome right here. Locate, evaluate, organize, and use primary and secondary research material. Now, when my students see language like that, they get lost. There's a glazed look in their eye. They start scrambling to find their phone, and they kind of just want to ignore the conversation. They're like, okay, Dr. Scott is just going to evaluate. He's going to interpret this in his own way, and I'll just try my best and trust that he's going to do the right thing. I think that learning outcome isn't really written in a way that students that they can connect with. And when you're writing assignment learning outcomes, I think they have to be relatable to students. If and when you ultimately teach a class, one tip that I might offer you is to ask your students to comment on your outcomes and let you know if they understand them. And of course, maybe practice those outcomes, like ask students, like here on the sample essay, where do you see this sample essay attaining these outcomes? Here's how I interpreted this outcome here for a major assignment that I often teach in English 1105. So create an information graphic using data you found through a governmental website or database. Of course, I'm going to teach students how to create such a database or how to create such an information graphic, and we can talk about how readers often find such data persuasive. The point here is that I've taken a course learning outcome, this really kind of long thing here, and I've aligned it with something that I want students to do for a particular assignment, this right here. Most importantly, though, I think students understand what it is I'm asking for when I say this. They're going to create an information graphic. I think I can then make a pretty good case that doing this is also fulfilling part of this learning outcome here. It's aligned, in other words. It's also reflecting my values and what I think is important in the class. Like, I understand this, but I need to be able to put that into language that I get, that I understand, and that I can get behind. And for me, I can sell this to my students. I had a much harder time selling that language that was just up on the screen. There's a visual aid that I frequently use when I'm preparing a class. I did it for this class that I'm teaching right now, where I take the bigger outcomes for maybe the program, and then I decide what are the outcomes for the class, and then from the class to the assignment. Let me switch screens and show you what that looks like. So this little table here, I put these together when I'm preparing to teach a class, particularly if it's something that I'm teaching for the first time, or if I'm teaching a new assignment or overhauling a class. I kind of want to go back to, okay, what are the big program outcomes or the course level outcome? And this is this big one here. Then, what's an assignment outcome that kind of rolls up to that? Well, it's this one here. And what you might find is that you're going to have multiple of these assignment outcomes that are going to be tied back to that big course outcome. And then in the last column, so I think what I'm trying to say here is that you could have, like, you would split this column, and then this is one assignment outcome that addresses part of this big course outcome, and you might have 2 or 3 of these here, splitting this row up into 2 or 3 different cells that are kind of speaking to different parts of this bigger course outcome. So course outcome, assignment outcome, and then supports, activities, formative assessments. Formative assessments are kind of like the check-ins that you have with students to make sure that they're on track. So instead of just having them write and create an information graphic and include it in their final essay and they get no feedback on it, I want to give them multiple opportunities to kind of check in on that. So I'm going to practice using grade data. I share with students how many A's, how many B's, C's, and D's I give out over the last 5 or 6 years teaching first-year writing. And then I give them that data and say, here's the number of A's, B's, C's, D's, F's. Now create different charts and graphics that kind of tell a story about Dr. Scott. Is he a hard ass or not? So we kind of play around with that. And then ultimately they're going to draft their information graphic for the big assignment due at the end of the semester, and they're going to post that and get feedback from me and get feedback from their peers. So it's a formative assessment. It helps kind of form whether or not they're on the right track. So developing something like this, it's really helpful for me to kind of make sure that I'm covering the course outcomes, but then also kind of thinking through, like, what language makes sense to me, like what can I sell to students that they can also make sense of. I think students are going to understand this. If I was to just throw this at students, I think that they would kind of freak out and they probably wouldn't pay much attention. One last thing before you set off to write your learning outcomes and to start posting some ideas about the kind of assignment that you're going to create for your final project. Just because you're writing outcomes for an assignment doesn't mean that you can't do something weird. It doesn't mean that you can't change things up. If it seems like a change is going to lead to better learning, for more learning among your students, like, you definitely make those changes. Just because you've created learning outcomes, it doesn't mean that you're locked into how you envisioned how students are going to attain those outcomes. I hope that makes sense. You can change things up. Coming up with learning outcomes, it just provides you, I use this metaphor a lot when I teach, it provides you a North Star. It says, okay, there's a place that we're trying to get to, and we can change up how we go about doing it. For me, I found learning outcomes not limiting nearly as much as I found them helpful in making decisions. If a student was to approach me and say, Dr. Scott, you have us writing this kind of formal essay, in English 1105 that's, 12 pages long, I'd like to try taking a different approach. Now, I might say yes, I might say no, but I ask myself, will that change? Are they still going to be able to meet the learning outcomes for that assignment? And if the answer is yes, and I don't have a good reason to say no, I frequently say yes. Because if the student has that kind of choice and has that kind of agency, I think that they're more invested in their learning. And I think the learning outcomes just kind of set up the parameters and help me make decisions as an educator. Last note, I highly recommend that you check out some of the supplemental resources from the Writing Across the Curriculum, the WAC Clearinghouse. They have a ton of different kinds of resources for different types of writing assignments. You can take a look at those and borrow from those. You also can take a look at the journal called Prompt, and I'll put a link down in the supplemental resources. You can take a look at that. That's just folks sharing academic prompts and writing about those prompts. So a couple really excellent resources to come up with assignment ideas. And I'm super excited to see what you all come up with. All right, that's it for now.